I'd like to call to order the February 15th, 2011 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council's Finance Committee. We will begin with public comment. If there's any members of the public wishing to speak on a topic not on the agenda, seeing none, we will go to the first item on the agenda, a report on the status of revenues and expenditures in relation to budget as of December 31, 2010. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. And as you indicated, we are here to present to you the mid-year report. And as you may know, every month we present to Council a report on how we're doing on our revenues and expenditures in relation to budget. It's a status report. Clearly, the beginning part of the year, the reports it's difficult to predict any kind of trends early on, but at mid-year we do take the opportunity to come to the Finance Committee and Council and to present to you a more comprehensive report. We've done a lot of analysis to show where we're at mid-year, but also how it looks for the rest of the year, and even use this number for purposes of budgeting next year. But the focus of our discussion is how we're doing at mid-year, both revenues and expenditures, and then what's it looking like for the rest of the year to see if we have any unusual trends. Jill Tara will start with the presentation. She's our Treasury Manager. She'll start with the revenues of the General Fund, and Rudy will take over on General Fund expenditures and enterprise funds. We also have some adjustments that we're recommending to Council to make at this point. We typically don't make these kind of adjustments at mid-year, but we do have some items that we think need adjustment. We'll be back in the third quarter or sometime around April to report to you how some of the things we're looking at that are trending unfavorably, that we're not recommending any adjustments at this point, but we might have to come back to the point to Council to adjust the budget based on some of the things we're seeing right now. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jill Tara, our Treasury Manager.
Great. Ms. Tara.
Good afternoon, Chair Francisco and committee members. I'm Jill Tara, Treasury Manager, and as Mr. Samario indicated, I'll go through the general fund revenues with collections through the first half of the fiscal year, which is 6 months ended December 31st. It's at this point of the year that we can really begin to make some meaningful analysis regarding how our general fund revenues are performing and begin to look at where we might end the year. So this is the point in the year where we start looking at forecasting out how the second half of the fiscal year will be doing. As you can see on the overhead, this is an excerpt from the table on page 1 of the attachment in the agenda report. I'll go through the first four up above that first line, which is the sales tax, property tax, utility users tax, or UUT for short, and TOT, which is the city's transient occupancy tax, or bed tax for short. Those are four major key general fund non-departmental tax revenues. And as such, they make up 55% of general fund revenues. And so what I'll do is I'll go through briefly this report and point out some of the budgetary issues or items of note on this, and then we'll go into those four in a little bit more detail. So first, let me walk you through for the benefit of our new committee member as well as the benefit of the public at home, how to read this schedule. And down the left-hand side, you'll see the different sales tax, the different non-departmental tax revenues as well as other revenue categories. Across the top, the first column is the annual budget, so that represents what we expect what we expected at the beginning of the year to achieve in each of those revenues, individual revenues and revenue categories. The next column over is year-to-date budget. And for the tax revenues in that top section, it is based on a 3-year average collections of what we received through the first 6 months of the year. So that's on a 3-year average, that's how much we collect each year. The next column over, the year-to-date actual, represents what we actually have collected for the first 6 months of the year. And then the next column over, the year-to-date variance, is the difference between the two. So you can see how we're doing relative to our year-to-date average collections 6 months through the year. Down in the other section, the other revenue section, that year-to-date budget is just a straight line annualized basis. So it just represents 50% of the budget, and those tend to come in more straight line rather than seasonally like our tax revenues. So, for example, if we look at the sales and use tax line item, the first line item up there, the annual budget is $16.7 million, and the 3-year average collections at halfway through the fiscal year is $6.71 million. You can see that year-to-date through the end of December, we collected $6.74 million. So we have a positive year-to-date variance of just over $30,000. Year-to-date percent received was 40.38%, which is a little bit better than that three-year average benchmark of 40.2%. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see in the council agenda report is a cash receipts analysis that shows how we're doing on our cash collections through the 6 months of the fiscal year compared to cash collections last year. But we prefer to focus on the budgetary analysis because it is more meaningful based on our expectations of what will happen this fiscal year. So if you go to the total taxes, that subtotal line item, year-to-date actual, we've collected $27.38 million, which is a positive variance of 1.3 over that three-year average benchmark. So we're doing a little bit better than we were last year in terms of, or over our three-year average. If we go down into the other revenue section, there's three that I'd like to talk about in a little bit more detail, and they are detailed in the attachment to the council agenda report. The first being intergovernmental. You can see the year-to-date variance for the intergovernmental revenue categories is negative $324,670. And there are several different revenues that go into this revenue category, but the largest of which is the mutual aid revenue, which is revenue that the fire department collects when it responds to emergencies outside our jurisdictions. We bill for that and reimbursed for our expenses. That revenue is expected to have approximately a $900,000 shortfall by the end of the fiscal year. Now, there will be some expenditure savings because we do bill based on our actual expenses, but by the end of the year, we expect that category to be short by about $450,000 based on a net basis. The next category down is the fees and service charges, and you can see there's a negative budget variance year-to-date of $619,000, almost $620,000, and there are several reasons for that. One is in the Parks and Recreation Department due to rain and other seasonal factors. Field rentals as well as tennis permits have been down, and they've also, due to the economy, seen a decline in their facility rentals. Now, the good news about this is that it will be offset by a corresponding amount of expenditure savings, so we don't expect a net negative impact of that. We also have seen a shortfall in the salary and benefits reimbursement that comes into community development as well as the city attorney for services provided to the RDA. The RDA, the Redevelopment Agency, has no staff of their own. Their employees are general fund employees, and they reimburse the general fund for that. And so there have been some staff vacancies and less billings in the city attorney's department, and so there's a shortfall there. That, of course, corresponds to an expenditure savings also, so it's no net negative impact. And then there is about $100,000 negative variance expected by year end for the engineering work orders because of vacancies. They've been billing less, and so that explains that number. The next line down, the miscellaneous category, you'll see a positive year-to-date variance of $237,000, and that's primarily due to billed admin citation revenues. And some of that will not be realized at year end. As those code violations are corrected, then that will be written off. But we do record the revenue when we bill it, and then we adjust it at year end. So that may or may not come in. We're probably expecting that most of that positive variance won't be realized at year end. So that covers that. The very bottom section, you'll see there's a variances section, and none of those budgeted revenues will be realized as a revenue. We budget those as a budget balancing measure. We expect them to come in as expenditure savings in the various different departments. We don't know exactly where or how they'll come in, so we put them as a revenue, recognizing that they'll come in a different category at the end of the year. With that, we'll move on to our big four major tax revenues, the first of which is sales tax. And as you know, we receive sales tax, the state advances us, and then we find out our true and actual collections for a particular quarter 3 months in arrears. So at midway through the fiscal year, we only have one actual quarter worth of data, which is the September 30th quarter. You can see that came in at $4.4 million. with growth of 3.9% over the September quarter of the previous fiscal year in 2010. We budgeted flat, so that did result in a positive budget variance, and we're very happy with that. Based on the performance and what we see in our bed tax and our expectations of what's going on in the economy, we're able to forecast out, and we expect that the December quarter, those results will be known in mid-March. We expect that quarter to come in for 3% growth, the March quarter 2% growth, and the June quarter based on a 4% you'll see in the previous year of fiscal year 2010. The June quarter grew 4%, so we expect to grow just 1% over that positive growth last year. That would leave us at $17.1 million is our best estimate at this point in time, where we think we'll end the year, giving us a positive budget variance of $680,000 in sales tax. So that's good news at this point. We'll have more information in March when we get our December quarter in, which has the Thanksgiving and Christmas holiday seasons in it. On to property tax. Property tax is our largest general fund revenue source, and the historical growth over the last 5 years is roughly 7.5%. So you can see once the recession hit, what a big impact it had on this major revenue for our general fund. Fiscal year 2009, property tax grew 3.6%, and in 2010 came in at a decline of almost 1%, at 0.8% decline. We budgeted conservatively this year, not knowing how quickly the sales were going to turn around, as well as how quickly median home prices would recover. We budgeted down 1.1%, and as you can see, the last column over the revised fiscal year 2011, we think we're going to come in end the year very close to budget at $22.8 million. That's about a $50,000 positive budget variance. Now, the property tax number, the first line, the $23 million, most of that is set from the county, so we're comfortable with that number. There is some volatility and uncertainty in the supplemental property tax line item, and that's supplemental taxes that are charged to buyers when they buy a home at a price higher than what it is on the assessed value, and we've really seen that decline. The historical supplemental property taxes collected were in the $500,000 to $750,000 range, so we've really seen that drop off. You can see down at the bottom, the year-to-date supplemental that we've received through September is $166,000, so we feel comfortable we'll meet that. And the other notable thing is that the county increased substantially the property tax admin fee that they're charging us, and we're working with the county right now to understand why. You can see that historically it runs, $416,000 in 2009, $429,000 in 2010. We estimated it to be about $443,000, came in at $550,000, and it appears to be due to a cost allocation methodology change, but we're still working with the county on understanding that, and we'll report out as we get more information on that. So at the end of the year, we expect property tax to meet budget, and that's good news, as it is one of our largest revenue source.
Mr. Chair.
Sure. Mr. White?
Thank you. Let me ask a question. Ms. Tora, on the supplemental and the number of transactions, is that the direct ratio? In other words, the more transactions you have, the more supplemental you have, and so since the transaction number is down, the supplemental is down.
Yes,
is there a pretty close link there?
Well, that's part of it. For property transfer tax, that's certainly true, because that's more based on, it's a percent of the value that turns over, which corresponds to the number of transactions. But supplemental, there's two factors, not just the number that turn over, but the median home price. So what happens is every time a property changes hands, they reassess it at close to market.
Right.
So to the extent, so it's a two-pronged factor there. Does that answer your question?
So however, there is a correlation between the number of transactions and the amount of supplemental, or not?
I guess no. I guess it's based on that reassessment on the market, to answer your question. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
It was a confusing answer. Yeah.
Ms. Self?
So the supplemental, say a house had previously sold for $1 million and now it sold for $800,000, there would be no supplemental tax coming in sales that are less than previously assessed.
That is correct.
Thank you.
That is correct.
Okay.
We'll move on to transient occupancy tax, which is our bed tax, and this is our big performer this year. It's also we use in terms of forecasting and seeing how we're doing and using it to try and predict. We use it as a leading indicator. Very often in the economy, sales tax is considered a leading indicator, but for our particular city, it's not. We don't receive information from it until a quarter after it's happened, which is far too late for us to plan for it. Our transient occupancy tax comes in from the hotels on the 10th of the month. It has to be postmarked by the 10th of the next month, so we receive information about it right away, and I send that out to council and to members of the public as we receive it. You can see that the effect of the economy on our transient occupancy tax in fiscal year 2009, we saw a 6.9% decline, a slightly less decline in fiscal year 2010 as the transient occupancy tax growth returned to positive growth in the second half of the fiscal year. That was an overall decline of 4.8%. We budgeted conservatively in fiscal year 11, assuming 0% growth from where we thought we would be at the end of the year, but since we did a little bit better, we could actually decline 2.7% and still meet budget. What's happened this year, as you know from the reports that have gone out, that in the first half of the fiscal year, our year-to-date growth in bed tax has been 9.7%, and for 4 of the 6 months, we've had double-digit revenue. We've assumed a 3% growth for the second half of the fiscal year, and budgeted that conservatively in our estimates, expecting to end the year at $12.2 million, which would leave us with growth of 6.6% over the previous fiscal year. And you can see, it may appear that 3% is conservative, and it is, but you can look in particularly May and June of 2010, and you can see that those are the months where we bring in a proportionally larger share of bed tax as we enter into our tourist season, and also those months also grew 6 and 12%. So it's going to be a lot harder to achieve large growth in those months where we've seen some recovery last year. But we thought overall 3% is probably pretty reasonable and would leave us with a $1.07 million budget surplus at the end of the year. For perspective, though, that $12.2 million, if we do achieve that, would put us back to the TOT level collected in 2006. So that's about 5 years' worth of lost growth.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so 2008 was basically were all months positive in 2008 in terms of, was that still on the happy track?
I don't have that information here, but I believe it started to decline at the end of 2008, and I don't remember how many months of decline exactly, but it did begin before 2009, for sure.
Okay, because it looks like an earlier, sort of the peak season of 09, we're still seeing growth there, July and August, and then September.
And
turns,
I'd be happy to send you that information after the meeting, so we can
Thank you.
take a closer look at that. The final revenue I'll go through today is utility users tax, and this is the most volatile of our major general fund tax revenues. It's highly dependent on commodity prices, and demand is highly elastic depending on a number of factors, seasons, the weather, and also the economy and how much people are trying to save. So you can see that this major revenue source brings in about $7 million a year. We've budgeted for fiscal year 2011 at just over $7 million. Modest growth budgeted at 0.4%. And year-to-date, we appear to be overall right on track. Year-to-date, we've received 50.1% of the budgeted revenue, and our 3-year average collection 6 months through the fiscal year is 50.2%. So we're right on track. But since each of the sectors has its own particular quirks and volatility associated with it, we do see that we're not meeting our budget, our year-to-date budget in the telephone, refuse, and water, and it's a little hard to see with that orange up there. So we're slightly behind on those, but we did conservatively budget electric and gas, assuming that commodity prices would be lower than they actually are, and so the gains in the electric and the gas sector are really carrying us. So overall, we think we'll meet budget. So in summary, in looking at the general fund revenues, I think it's fair to say that it's good news on the revenue front. We expect that the positive variances in sales tax and our bed tax to equal approximately $1.75 million. And the shortfalls in the departmental revenues will likely be offset by a corresponding amount of expenditure savings, as I indicated before. However, there are some budgetary adjustments, and Rudy Livingston, our accounting manager, will go through those next. And there's also some other contingencies out there in terms of overtime in fire and potentially in police that could consume some of that positive budget variances. And lastly, I'd like to note that on an ongoing basis, this positive revenue surplus that we're expecting has already been factored into the multi-year analysis that Council reviewed at the February 3rd budget work session. So in terms of multi-year forecasting and could this have any effect on future years, yes, it has effect, and we've already taken that into account in coming up with that projected $3 million deficit for next year that we've got to tackle for a 2-year financial plan. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tara. Any questions from committee members? Okay. Mr. Livingston.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. My name is Rudy Livingston. I'm the accounting manager for the city, and I'm here to talk about the expenditures for the general fund and also the revenues and expenses for the enterprise funds. After we get done with that, we'll talk about some adjustments that we're proposing at mid-year, and we'll walk through those. Generally, as for the benefit of our public, I wanted to kind of walk through the schedule. It's laid out similar to the revenue schedule. We, in the general fund on this, we break it out by department, and if you look at it, you have the adjusted annual budget, and that includes the adopted budget plus any adjustments that have been made subsequent to adoption that could be for additional appropriations or perhaps some carryovers that might have come forward from last year. And so that's where our budget sits as of December 31st. With the expenditures, we allocate those for a year-to-date basis at 50%, knowing that for the most part, expenditures in the general fund are incurred roughly at a pro rata basis because 75% of our expenditures are in salaries and benefits, and those are in effect for most of the year. The third column is the year-to-date actual, which shows where we actually, what expenditures we actually have had. And then the fourth column is a year-to-date variance without encumbrances. And for the discussion today, I'm going to leave the encumbrances out. Encumbrances are items that are a liability that we have, contracts we've entered into or so forth, that we anticipate to use throughout the year or perhaps even into a subsequent year. But at mid-year, these can really throw off some analysis because we'd be picking up 100% of what encumbrance is there, and it really may be a long-term effect. And so we're going to leave that out of our discussion today. If there's any questions about encumbrances, though, I'd be more than happy to talk about those. I want to look at the overall budget that we're seeing there. The adjusted budget has two items that have been adjusted in there. We're going to be discussing those as part of the proposed proposed mid-year adjustments related to the labor concessions in the fire and the police departments. But because we anticipate that that will be approved by council, because it's merely a shifting from one area to another, we have included that and incorporated that into our analysis here. I want to discuss three general fund departments that have negative variances at December 31st. And the first one is the city attorney, which, as you see, has a small variance of $23,000. This is almost entirely attributable to the retirement of a city attorney at the very beginning of the year. And when he retired, he had vacation cash out that had been accumulated, and so that threw them over. They anticipate that they will be within their budgetary appropriations limits by the end of the year, so we don't foresee any issues with that. The second one is the police department, and if you look at that, we have $187,000 of negative variance. This is almost totally attributable to overtime costs associated with Fiesta and the July 4th celebrations that are also incurred at the very beginning of the year. And as we go throughout the remainder of the year, we anticipate that they are going to be within their budgetary allotment. One thing I will note is they may experience a little bit of overage in overtime, but they do have a $200,000 appropriated reserve that we will be able to use to cover that, any overages that we might have there. But we will be keeping a very close eye on that over the coming months, and we will let you know if there are any issues that come up, and if there are any supplemental appropriations that are needed, we will bring those to you as quickly as we identify those. But at this point, we think we'll be okay with those. The last one that I want to discuss is the fire department. That's a fairly large variance of $423,000. And this is mostly related to overtime costs that they have incurred in the fire department this year. They have certain minimum staffing requirements. They've got shifts that they have to cover, and they've had an extraordinary number of people that have been out on medical leave or sick leave during the year, and they've had to backfill and cover those. And because of the coverage requirements, they've incurred a significant amount of overtime. We will be requesting that some of their overtime budget be reduced in conjunction with the mutual aid revenue that we're going to be writing down. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But at this point in time, we are not sure exactly how this is going to all shake out. A lot of this happened at the beginning of the year, and so some of these people that have retired, we won't have salaries for them going into the future, and we won't have overtime costs to cover some of those. And so we're going to keep an eye on this over the next couple of months, and we will bring this item back to you in the third quarter analysis and report that we do with you, that we will give to you probably in April, I believe. So those are the only items I wanted to talk about on the general fund, other than to note that on a total level for all the departments, we are actually under our mid-year budget by 0.6%. So overall, the general fund is expecting to meet budget, and we are not expecting any overall issues. It's just those police and fire are really the ones we have our eye on right now. If there are any questions about the general fund expenditures, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll shift to the enterprise funds.
Mrs. South?
Thank you, Chair Francisco. What is non-departmental?
I always love that one because we have a non-departmental department. I laugh every time I say that. Non-departmental is all of the. There are certain costs that are kind of on a citywide basis, well, general fund wide, such as debt service on some bonds that we have. There are some CV costs for the community, the CVB for advertising and community promotions, and those type of things are generally the items that are in there, and capital also. Correct.
Okay.
Okay, this schedule that I'm going to be addressing is actually on page 8 of the attachment 2 to the agenda report. With the enterprise funds, we have a similar type schedule, but similar to the way that we lay out the general fund tax revenues. We do a seasonal adjustment on them based upon the 3-year average collection rate. We do the same thing for our enterprise fund revenues. And so you'll look at that, and we have a 3-year average. We compare where they should be. For instance, water fund revenues, the 3-year average would be 54.9% collection rate through December 31st. We compare that to what they actually collected, and then we calculate our variance on that. I'm going to be discussing briefly a few of these variances that we have. The first one is the water revenues. The water revenues at mid-year are almost $600,000 below the year-to-date seasonal budget. The big reason for that is the wet and cool weather that we have had in the first part of this fiscal year. Some reports show that we've had up to 3 times as much rain as we would normally have in a year. And the actual usage is what drives the budget variance. And when there's significantly less usage, then, of course, the revenues, the water sales are down significantly. We're not sure exactly where they are going to end up the year because a lot of that will be determined by our weather patterns over the final 6 months of the year. However, the staff are expecting that we will be under budget on our revenues in the water fund. What they also will be is under budget on their expenses, and they will make sure that they are covering basically any revenue shortfall with their expense savings. And some of it's directly attributable. We don't produce as much water, we don't have as much treatment costs and some of that. So it does kind of even out a little bit in there. But they will be making a conscientious effort to provide savings to offset any revenue shortfalls. The next one I want to talk to is about this downtown parking fund. Well, it's showing
on that, Mr. Chair?
Sure, of course. That's right.
But is it not true that their biggest way that their biggest option for reducing their expenditure is to reduce their capital program in terms of pipe replacement? Isn't that a major piece that you may not do if it's a long-term need, but it doesn't stop the water system
Correct.
from working?
That is correct. If there are things that are going to be reduced, it won't impact the water service, if that's the question. I mean, they can be replacing pipes, but they have a regular pipe replacement program anyways, and so they're always taking certain areas out of service for a very short period while they repipe the area. But there are a lot of different things. There are treatment costs, chemicals, there are various areas, but that is certainly one of the areas that they could be looking at.
Thank
yes. Downtown parking fund revenue is slightly below the year-to-date average at $77,000. This is not an area of concern for the fund, as they anticipate that their year-end revenues will meet their budget, and their projections show that they should be right on by the end of the year. Once again, they have a lot of expenses in their fund that they can move between years and postpone some of them, some maintenance costs and things that they will use if they need to reduce expenses to make the things balance in the downtown parking fund. Excuse me. So they're not overly concerned with that. You know, they have projects that are ongoing, but they'll space them out as they need to. The airport fund I want to briefly mention, it's showing a fairly good positive variance in there, $660,000, and I just want to mention this because it is important to note that we have seen that passenger traffic has begun to increase once again at the airport. And so that is a very positive sign for them. We're good timing because the terminal will be opened, I believe, in May or June. And so as things are starting to pick up, we're going to be getting more capacity available. And so that they're really excited about the things that are happening out there. Expenses are also a little bit below.
Mr. White, you have a question?
I do, thank you.
Yes.
And that is on the airport. I noticed in the report that it talked about fuel sales were up.
Yes.
And did not the self-serve system come online
Yes.
this year? And was that a significant contributor?
Yes, that has been a contributing factor. It has been much more, it's been a very positive thing for them. And they've reported that that has shown really good results for the self-fueling system, yes.
Okay, great. Thank
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. The expenses on the airport are going to be under budget, and part of that is because until they open the new facility, they aren't going to have as many expenses as they anticipated for the maintenance and costs at the terminal. Gulf Fund revenues, you're probably all well aware that they are lagging, and they have been lagging. The good thing is that the number of rounds of golf have been increasing, and they're fairly in line with the target. The bad news about that is that a number of those rounds that are being played are being played during off-peak times, reduced revenue times. And so the revenues are lagging while the actual activity at the golf course is kind of on par with what was expected. They also will be looking at expenses and be holding back on those to make sure that they're meeting their balancing efforts there. The last one that I want to mention is the Waterfront Fund, where they are $249,000 under budget at mid-year. And there are two principal factors in that. One is that slip transfer fees have been really lagging in the first 6 months of the year. That has been very difficult for them to predict. They thought that perhaps it was related to the real estate market to a degree, and then it had a spike, and so it kind of threw that out. But it has been lagging, although they told me that in January and February they've actually picked up a little bit. So we're not sure exactly where they will end up in that area at the end of the year. The second area that has been a negative variance in there is in the parking revenues, and that is mostly attributable to the cold and foggy weather that they've experienced at the waterfront area this last during the summer primarily, where it was really bizarre. If you ever went down there, you'd have fog on one side of Cabrillo Boulevard and sun on the other side in places. And so they're anticipating that for the year their revenues will fall short of budget, but they once again will be looking at expense savings so that they can offset those. And that's all that I have to say on the enterprise funds, unless there are any questions.
Questions from committee members? No.
Then we will move to the proposed year-end adjustments that we have. And I'll kind of go through some of these quickly, but I want to make sure that we know what each one of them is about. So if there are any questions, please ask, and I'll be more than happy to discuss them. The city clerk's office has incurred additional cost for a special ballot measure that was for the medical marijuana issue this last year. They finally got the bill for that at $20,000, and they're asking for additional appropriations to pay for their costs. This actually came in a little bit lower than what they were anticipating because there were more ballot measures countywide, and so the actual cost that we were charged was a little bit reduced on that. The fire department, there are a few things in there. The first two have to do with the mutual aid revenue. As Jill indicated, they're projecting that they're going to be approximately $900,000 below budget on their mutual aid revenues. It's interesting that we just haven't had the number of call-ups that we had anticipated, and part of that is because there haven't been as many fires out there that needed that, but there's also apparently been a change in protocol as to the order in which people are called up. It appears that the state is calling up Forest Service personnel before they're calling up the local jurisdictions to fight these fires. And so because of that, we're anticipating approximately $900,000 negative variance in those revenues. Now, part of what generates that revenue is the overtime that they have to provide, and we're proposing a corresponding reduction in mutual aid overtime. They don't go dollar for dollar because there's an overhead factor built in, and there's a lot of things. But we're proposing that we reduce the overtime budget in the fire department by $550,000, which is a partial offset to that negative revenue variance. The third item up there's a hazmat reimbursement. At the beginning of the year, when they were putting the budget together, they were debating the feasibility of charging a fee when we responded to accident scenes, especially when there were hazmat conditions there. This ended up being in the budget, and about the time that the budget was adopted, with discussions with our city attorney, it was determined that this is probably not an area that we wanted to go into at this point in time, and so they are proposing that we reduce their budgeted revenues by $100,000 for that line item. There's an item on there following that for bargain labor concessions. And I'm going to put that one off for just a moment because we have a schedule where we'll go through the police and the fire and the whole labor discussions. The department is requesting an additional $40,000 to purchase portable defibrillators. And they keep those in most of in the fire trucks, and the ones that they've had have been around for a few years, and the company that manufactured those was bought up by another company who decided that they were not going to maintain that line. And so they're not able to get replacement equipment for those, and they have been forced to purchase other defibrillators to carry on their trucks, and apparently they use these quite frequently, and so it's an important expenditure for them, and so we're requesting that you grant that appropriation request. To help pay for that, we are asking that you would increase our estimated revenues by $52,000 for some insurance proceeds that we received in the fire department for some water damage that was incurred at their office buildings this last year. And so it's not quite a wash. A little bit, we come out a little bit on the positive side, but that's that one. We'll pass over the police ones and the non-departmental. And the next one that I will talk about, and this is in the county library fund. As you know, the city administers a library system for Santa Barbara County, and we incur costs, we get reimbursements, we get revenues from the county and from different partners in there. Well, this time, we actually, the Goleta branch received a $4,000 contribution to the library with the stipulation that that be used to purchase children's books. And so we are requesting additional appropriations in book acquisitions of $4,000, and we want to increase estimated revenues by $4,000 corresponding to that. So the net effect on the county library fund is zero by this change. Yes.
If I could, I just wanted to point out that in the general fund section, the top section, you can see that the appropriations that are being requested in light of the revenue estimates that we're proposing to change, it's going to have an impact of almost $810,000 to the general fund, which means that there will be, at least at this point, an additional use of reserves of $809,000 on a budgetary basis. Now, you know, Ms. Tara just went through all the revenue estimates and projections and indicated that we are going to have some surpluses at the end of the year. We're not going to propose, or we're not proposing to adjust revenues up to cover those. Revenues will end the year ahead of budget and will offset, more than offset, this $809,000 budgeted use of reserves. So just not to scare you that we're going to be using reserves by the end of the year, this will be completely offset, more than offset by revenue surpluses that we're not proposing that we adjust the budget for.
Thanks for pointing that out.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. White.
I had a question about the fire and mutual aid revenue.
Yes.
I know that Santa Barbara County had a very benign fire season last year. I don't recall whether that was statewide or not. Did you have any sense of that?
It was historically slow.
So it was slow everywhere. So
yes.
that the low overtime could, I mean, yes, they're going to go to the Forest Service first, but when it hits the fan, they're calling everybody they can.
That's correct.
And so that very well could be the situation in this summer.
Yes, and if it gets to the point where we would need to be responding to those, we could certainly bring an adjustment, a proposed adjustment to council to increase the overtime budget for that.
Okay.
And we certainly would. 2 years ago was actually a very high fire
Right.
season. We've had some of those in the past few years, and,
Right.
and sometimes it just seems like the whole state's on fire, and then this year was just kind of real nice. 2 years ago, just to put it in perspective, we had budgeted about $2 million of mutual aid revenue. Last year, we reduced that to a little over $1 million. And now we're anticipating that it's going to be $340,000 roughly for this year. So it has gone down dramatically over the course of the last couple of years. There are a couple more adjustments that I want to go through. The Streets Grant Capital Fund. This is a fund that receives grant money primarily from the state and the feds and uses it for capital projects. This is basically a reallocation of various things. Some of these projects are basically done, or we're not going to be getting any more money on these things, and so we're requesting in essence that we're closing out the funding source and the expenditures related to these projects, and that we are programming additional expenditures for the top three are ones that we are reducing our expenditure budget and our revenues for those, and the bottom three we are requesting additional appropriations, but those will be funded through grants from the state and the federal government. Measure D fund is the next item on there, and people hear Measure D and they think, oh, Measure D is done. Well, the funding source for Measure D is complete, and now we're collecting revenues under Measure A. But there was still money that was collected for Measure D purposes, and there are continuing expenditures, and we hope that they will be able to complete most of those capital projects that they'll be working on in this fiscal year. This one right here is essentially a reprogramming of some of those costs. The Goleta Transportation Improvement Plan is expired now, and so there's the $133,000 that the Public Works Department is asking to reappropriate to different projects, and these are all within that fund. $68,000 to the Hollister Avenue sidewalk infill and $65,000 to the Ortega Bridge project. This is a net zero effect on appropriations in there, but we wanted to make sure that council's aware of the items that are going through, and people aren't moving money around at their own will. So that's basically what this is, a reprogramming of those funds.
Mr. White?
Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I can picture the $68,000 for the Hollister infill, but how does GTIP money get moved over to the Ortega Bridge?
Those are funds that would be used as part of our match for the grant that we'll have for the Ortega Bridge project. So that's our we're doing an expenditure for those funds.
Okay, and so Goleta isn't cranky about it, or okay?
No.
Okay.
Essentially, the obligation for the GTIP money expired, and we are satisfying interest in that area with the Hollister project, but we really don't have an obligation to
spend it there. Okay, thank you.
And just for the benefit of the public, I will kind of repeat what Ms. Anderson mentioned, because probably couldn't hear, that the GTIP, I guess as it's called, it did expire, and so we're reprogramming some of those monies that are in that area for the Hollister Avenue sidewalk infill. And the Ortega Bridge project, the city has a matching portion that we have to put towards that, and these funds are legitimate expenditures under Measure D, and so we are going to be asking to reprogram these to be for that purpose. The last item on there is in the internal service funds and information systems. We got up and running the GIS system last year, and once we get those implemented and fully operational, then we end up with having some annual licensing fee requirements. We weren't sure exactly when those were going to come about, and these items were not included in their operating budget. And so we are requesting additional appropriations out of the information services funds reserves to cover these licensing fees, and also to cover some training on the new software. And that's the end of the adjustments, except that we're going to discuss and go over this whole area of labor concessions. And Mr. Samario, I think, is going to lead us through that discussion.
Very good, Mr. Samario.
So in our budget, the adopted budget, we have included a couple of items that are generally referred to as year-end savings that are anticipated. And there are two categories. One is the typical or normal anticipated year-end variance that we would budget we've talked about this a lot before. And historically, we would budget a number representing what we expect to save on the expenditure side, and then surpluses we expect to generate on the revenue side. But obviously, the times are different now. But we do think it's appropriate for us to budget each year, at least for now, an anticipated variance on the expenditure side, because we typically do see anywhere from $1 million to $1.5 million per year in savings because of just turnover in staff, and people going to lower steps when we fill the positions from new staff or from the outside. So that number of $1.2 million is what's in the adopted budget, and we are not proposing to change that. As Ms. Tara indicated, we're not going to realize any revenues or in that line item. We're expecting to generate the savings on the expenditure side, so that's where we'll see that actually being realized by year end. The bottom section represents what we budgeted this year for the concessions that had not yet, in large part, which had not yet been realized by the time we adopted the budget, and primarily police and fire. But it also included amounts from the other labor groups that were negotiated that related to vacation cash outs that were foregone, that weren't going to be allowed. So for the concessions that were realized before the budget was adopted for non-safety groups, the salary and benefit portions were represented in their respective budgets in the salary and benefit categories, but for the vacation cash outs, we don't budget those amounts in any year, so we just showed those as year-end savings that we're expecting. But in total, the concessions for police and fire, plus vacation and cash outs for everybody else, total almost $2.4 million. What we're proposing to do is, for those concessions that we've now achieved from fire and police, it's the $635,000, the $615,000, and the $47,000, that we allocate those back to the expenditure budgets, because that's where those savings really will be achieved. So we're proposing to move those to those respective departments. To the right of that, you'll see that we didn't achieve all the concessions we thought we were going to realize in police and fire at the time we adopted the budget. We were short about $360,000. We were hoping to get somewhere in the order of 1.9, almost $2 million. We got a little bit less than that, closer to 1.6. So that's the column, the unrealized concession, that we're saying, let's get rid of those. We're not going to reclassify them. We're just going to get rid of those because those are savings that we're not going to realize based on what really transpired. So once we make these adjustments, what's going to be left on that far right column will still remain. We'll have two components: the year-end variance at the top that as I mentioned, but we're still going to leave in there $726,000, almost $727,000, representing the concessions from vacation cash outs that were suspended this year. So it's a number that's fairly large. It's not going to be a revenue we realize. We just know that on a cash basis, we're going to have those savings, even though we don't budget for those. We're going to spend that much money less, or that much less this year, because of those concessions. So there'll be real savings to the bottom line at the end of the year.
Mr. Lyon, I feel a question coming on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is that $600,000 unrealized amount? Is that the wrong number?
$342,000.
$342,000. Is that from the overhire? Is where that where did that money come? Where did that money not come from, or whatever?
Yeah. So let's take, for example, the Fire Association. You can see the third from the last line. When we adopted the budget, we anticipated that we would generate concessions of $706,000. When the concessions were actually finalized and negotiated, they totaled $635,000, which you see in the second column. So we achieved concessions of $71,000 less than we anticipated. And similarly for the POA, we achieved concessions of $228,000 less than we had anticipated, or at least budgeted. So those are amounts that we're not going to realize in savings, and so we're suggesting or recommending that we take them out of our revenue budget. So any questions on that? I know it's a little confusing. That's why we kind of put together a separate schedule.
Any other questions? Thank you. No, sure, of course.
So I think that concludes our report, unless there are other questions.
Okay. So we need a motion to accept the report, or to recommend that the council accept the 6-month report.
And also for the recommendations for these adjustments as well.
Right.
And to forward the recommendation for the adjustment.
All those in favor? Aye. Anything else you want to hit us with? This meeting is adjourned.